It's my pleasure to kickstart today's program. The Jerusalem Fund and Palestine Center's annual conference, One Palestine, the Struggle Against Apartheid. This year's conference happens during an extraordinary time, a very tragic time for Palestinians everywhere, and especially for our brothers and sisters in the Gaza Strip as they endure this bloody genocide that's been inflicted on them for more than a month. Today's conference will be an opportunity to hear from scholars, experts, and analysts who have dedicated their lives, careers, and knowledge production to help us understand Palestine and the Palestinian experience, and to allow us to delve deeper into the events that have led us to the moment that we are in today. We planned this conference way before the tragic events that have been unfolding in Gaza have unfolded, and the themes of this year's conference, whether the 75-year anniversary of the Nakba or the 30-year anniversary of Oslo, or the discussion on US policy and the ways US policy can be challenged and changed concerning Palestine, are all themes that are more relevant today than any other time. So with that, I welcome you all, and I anticipate an incredible discussion today, and I look forward to hear from our esteemed speakers who joined us from all over the world to be with us today. And I'm grateful for the attendees for joining us as well, and for taking the time to be part of this conversation. The Jerusalem Fund and the Palestine Center are in the heart of Washington, D.C., and have been around. The Jerusalem Fund has been around since the late 1970s, contributing to efforts to educate the American public and beyond on the Palestine question and on the Palestinian experience, and to uplift and improve the lives of Palestinians in Palestine and in the diaspora. We will hear more about the Jerusalem Fund, its mission, from Dr. Subhi Ali, who will address us shortly, and also from Dr. Eid Mustafa, who will talk to us as well, and who will be the master of ceremonies for today's conference. But before I pass the mic to Dr. Ali, just a few housekeeping rules. This entire conference will be live on Zoom, and the first panel on the Nakba at 75 will be followed by a 10-minute break, after which we will have our second panel on Oslo at 30, which will be followed by a 1-hour lunch break. So please don't log out, just keep your Zoom running. And then the lunch break will be followed by a third panel on US policy, which will be the last panel for today. Throughout the panels, feel free to ask any questions you have or leave any comments you would like to share, keeping them brief though, using the Q&A feature at the bottom of the screen of your Zoom. And please be mindful that we won't have plenty of time for an extensive discussion following each panel, so please make your questions direct, and we will make sure to convey them to our speakers and to our moderators. So with that, I would like to pass the mic to Dr. Subhi Ali, a surgeon based in Nashville, Tennessee, and the chairman of our board of directors, who will give the opening remarks for today's conference. Thank you.
Thank you, Jehad. And good morning, everybody. I would like to welcome you all to the 2023 Jerusalem Funds Annual Conference, which we are having again virtual, online, but hope to welcome you all in person at the Jerusalem Fund Auditorium in Washington, D.C. Inshallah. Today, we are having a robust program in 3 panels with a theme around One Palestine, the struggle against apartheid, which also focuses on the Nakba 75 since 1948. And it also looks like we are witnessing now a second Nakba 2023 with what's happening and taking place in Gaza and as we meet today. The 3 panels planned for today aim to shed light on the most pressing issues of the resilience of the Palestinian people, especially in light of the ongoing genocide in Gaza. But instead of spending a lot of time on that theme, I would like to introduce to you the Master of Ceremonies for today's conference, Dr. Eid Mustafa, who's also the Vice Chairman and Treasurer of the Jerusalem Fund for the last 20 years. Dr. Mustafa is a successful active plastic surgeon in Wichita Falls, Texas, and really needs no introduction. Dr. Mustafa.
Thank you, Dr. Ali, and thank you all for joining us. I believe that before I start, the gravity of the situation we're living in calls for a moment of silence and reflection, for all the innocent victims that have been lost and continue to be lost. A moment of silence, please. Thank you. Without further ado, it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Ghareeb. Professor Ghareeb will be moderating the first session. Dr. Ghareeb is a senior scholar at the Jerusalem Fund Palestine Center, an internationally recognized expert in the Middle East, Kurds, Iraq, and media issues. Dr. Ghareeb was the first Mustafa Barzani Scholar of Global Kurdish Studies at American University. He taught at George Washington, University of Virginia, Georgetown, Qatar, and McGill University. He's the author of 12 books on topics such as the Gulf War, Kurds, Iraq media, the new media revolution in the Middle East and Arab world, and US media coverage in the Middle East. We are proud to have Dr. Ghareeb as a main part of our Palestine Center, and it's my pleasure to turn this session over to Dr. Ghareeb.
Thank you, Dr. Eid, and good morning, everyone. This is really a historic moment that we are witnessing today. The topic of this conference, of course, is going to be on the Nakba, the 1948, but what we are seeing today is a continuation and perhaps is a even more dangerous period because of the impact, the events taking place, this genocide that's taking place in Gaza, and the positions that are being adopted by especially the superpowers, but particularly by the West. What we are seeing is that the shock of the death of civilians and of children, women, the numbers apparently, from what we have heard yesterday from one of the senior U.S. diplomats who had been in the region recently, Barbara Leaf, saying that the numbers are maybe much larger than the numbers we have heard. The numbers we have heard so far are about 11,000 people. And it's likely, from what we have heard from her, that it may be even close to 20,000. This is a truly horrifying figure. I mean, the killing of civilians, wherever they are, wherever religion they come from, whatever ethnicity, should be condemned. But I think the figures and what the activities that we're seeing in Gaza are really difficult to believe. In a way, this is what's happening is a marker as well as a warning. As a friend of mine who has been following this issue said, he said, it's a marker because this is the first time we've seen the Palestinians taking the military initiative, breaking out of Gaza, the open prison of Gaza, and attacking multiple targets inside Israel. The civilian casualties on the Israeli side has prompted calls for revenge and may, in fact, be being used to justify ethnic cleansing of Gaza. The conflict is also a warning to Palestinian civilians, especially the ones in Gaza who survived, that their eviction from the area, from Gaza, may be really what Israel is trying to achieve. We have heard from senior Israeli officials, military, as well as political, that there are no innocent civilians in Gaza. And that, in fact, what they are trying to push the people first from the north to the south, and then there were attempts, and by the way, this plan is not, this idea of pushing the people of Gaza out is not new at all. It was discussed, in fact, by the Bush administration, as well as also the President Mubarak of Egypt. It was rejected. And we are seeing it again now being pushed forward, or in fact, it's an attempt to create realities that are going to make it the destruction of the infrastructure, the destruction of hospitals, of schools, of mosques, of churches, of residential buildings, the denial of water, of food, of fuel. Medicine is unbelievable. I mean, this is unprecedented in many ways. Today we have an impressive panel of scholars, activists who are speaking to us today about the history of the Nakba of 1948, as well as specifically the events in Gaza. And then we are going to hear also about the impact. How does what's going on today in Gaza is affected by, or how did international law, and by what role are international human rights organizations are playing in this area. Our speakers today, our first speaker today, I will introduce all of them at one time, and then we'll start with the first speaker would be Professor Ilan Pappe, and then Dr. Irfan, and then Dr. Shawan Jabarin. I'll try to introduce all of them at the same time in the beginning, and then we'll take them one after the other. The first speaker, as I said, will be Professor Pappe, then Dr. Irfan, then Dr. Jabarin. Professor Pappe is very well-known historian. He is actually considered one of the revisionist historians, talking and writing about the Nakba events, about the history of the Palestinian-Israeli conflicts, about the creation of Israel and the expulsion and dispossession of the Palestinians. He is the director of the European Center for Palestine Studies at the University of Exeter. He received his PhD from Oxford University. And until 2007, he taught at the Haifa University. And he was later expelled from because of his writings, his ideological positions, and his rejection of the Zionist narrative of the Israeli government. He moved to Exeter University, where he teaches at the Institute of Arab and Islamic Studies. He has written 20 books to date. Of course, the most significant, and for us today, include a book with the title, The Ethnic Cleansing of Palestine, and on Palestine, which he basically wrote with Noam Chomsky. And his most recent book is The Biggest Prison on Earth, A History of the Israeli Occupation. Dr. Irfan is a lecturer in interdisciplinary race, gender, and post-colonial studies at University College in London. She has published several award-winning articles and outlets, including the Journal of Palestine Studies, Journal of Refugee Studies, and Jerusalem Quarterly, as well as contributing articles to newspapers such as the Washington Post, magazines such as The Nation, and Al Jazeera Network. Anne is the author of Refuge and Resistance, Palestinians and the International Refugee System, which has now recently been published by Columbia University Press. Our third speaker will be Dr. Jabarin, who is the General Director of Al-Haq since 2006, which is, if not the first, it's one of the first human rights organization in the Arab world. Jabarin received his BA in sociology from Birzeit University and a degree from human rights law from the National University of Ireland. He also took part in many graduate and advanced academic programs at Columbia and the University of Strasbourg. In 1987, Dr. Jabarin started his career at Al-Haq as a field researcher documenting human rights abuses by the Israeli occupying authorities throughout the occupied Palestinian territories. He then shifted to legal research and accepted a leadership position in international advocacy. He also served as a lecturer in Birzeit University and participated in various conferences on international criminal law. We really have an excellent panel this morning, and I look forward to, like you do, to hearing from them. Dr. Pappe, please go ahead.
Thank you very much. I want to thank the Jerusalem Fund for inviting me, and I'm very honored to share this panel with such two esteemed colleagues. As the organizers pointed out, this event was organized before the events of the 7th of October, and I was not sure myself whether I should change my basic presentation because of that, of course, of what is happening in the last 5 weeks. And on the other hand, in any case, it was supposed to be an historical presentation, but I did tweak somewhat the presentation in a way that would connect the past to the present. So in many ways, what I'm going to do is not just to recount the events of 1948 as we commemorate 75 years to the Nakba, which by itself is a very important assignment, because as many of you would know, a lot of people who see themselves as experts or diplomats or politicians or journalists who are involved in the issue of Palestine, either as mediators, as media people, or as diplomats or politicians, still seems to be very ignorant about 1948, not only in terms of the details of what happened, but of the meaning of what happened. And we still have, despite the fact that so many of us, like me, I suppose some of our participants and viewers are at the same state, despite the fact that we have devoted 40 years for, at least in my case, to try and educate people, it's still very difficult to challenge the Nakba denial, which always amazes me, because the documentation is so clear, the historical research is so excellent, done by the best historians in the world, and yet if you listen to speeches by diplomats who are involved in Palestine, politicians, presidents, prime ministers, mainstream media, the denial of the Nakba, which is either ignorance or intentional erasure of history, is on levels that I cannot compare it to any other event in the 20th century that is still contentious in the minds of people. So for instance, if I have to teach in my university, I have to fight demands, which I resist successfully, to balance the picture. I keep saying to my colleagues and university management, there's nothing to balance. I'm telling you the truth of what happened. They said, no, but you should bring the other side of the story. And I say, there isn't an other side of the story. This is the story. And there's nothing comparable to it. And either the history of Ireland or South Africa or Southeast Asia, you will not find a case where politically those who are managing universities, those who are editors of newspapers or mainstream channels would say to you, it's still contentious. And you keep asking them, what is contentious? That there was an ethnic cleansing? They said, yes, put the other point of view. And I say, the other point of view is lying about the ethnic cleansing. So why would you want me to put it in such a context? So, as I said, even without the events of the 7th of October, I would have given this lecture as it is, because the assignment is not just to challenge the horrific genocidal policies that are being enacted on the ground now, but we are part of a long struggle. And I think the first time I came to the Jerusalem Fund was in 1999, which is now 24 years ago. And this was the topic we were talking about. The fact that we are in Washington, and most of the people in Washington who are scholars, most of the people in Washington who are journalists, most of the people in Washington who are politicians, namely senators or members of the House, either have no idea of what happened or refuse to be educated of what happened and understand the meaning of what happened to what goes on today. And that was 1999. And it's, in many ways, it is frustrating that we need the Jerusalem Fund and other bodies to continue to struggle for the truth, let alone for stopping the criminal policies today on the ground. Having said that, and as I said, I would like to tweak a little bit the original contribution of mine, so that I would relate to what happened 75 years ago that is structural. In that, what do I mean by that? That I would point out to certain processes and events that shed light on what's going on today in Gaza. For some of you, this is not necessary, I'm sure, but I hope it will help those who need a bit more, need deeper knowledge of the historical connections of what is unfolding in front of our eyes in the Gaza Strip. So let me start with the beginning of what caused the catastrophe of 1948. And let us remind ourselves what the catastrophe consisted of. In dry, factual terms, it meant the expulsion of half of Palestine's population, the demolition of half of Palestine's villages, more than 500 out of 1,000, the total de-Arabization of most of the Palestinian towns, around 11 towns that were totally de-Arabized, and the construction or building of Jewish settlements over the ruins of the villages, or the planting of recreational forests on the ruins of the villages by the State of Israel, usually covering them with European pine trees in order to change also the natural landscape that was deemed to be too Arab in the eyes of the policymakers of Israel in the immediate aftermath of the events of 1948. So hopefully nobody argues anymore of the consequence of the essence of the catastrophe in terms of the magnitude of what happened to people who were the native and indigenous population of Palestine. Now, it is very clear to us today that there were two competing narratives of why did the Palestinians by the end of 1948 find themselves in this dismal and horrific situation after living for centuries without being expelled, without losing their lands, without losing the villages or towns, and while going through a normal process of modernization, national identity, and progress as the rest of the Eastern Mediterranean, the Mashriq, was going through. The Israeli narrative, even the liberal Israeli narrative until today, would say, well, they brought upon themselves this catastrophe. Had they not accepted the idea of the Jewish state over half of Palestine, and had they not called upon the Arab world to send troops in order to destroy the Jewish state, they would not have become refugees, and they would have remained in the place and so on. This is a blatant lie, and this is also an attempt to try and obfuscate the real nature of the Zionist movement as it appears very clearly from its own documentation. The Zionist movement was a settler colonial movement. It was not the only settler colonial movements. Settler colonial movements established the United States, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa. So it's not a unique phenomenon in history that Europeans come to someone else's land and claim it as their own by dispossessing the native population. It happened not only in Palestine. What was unique in the case of Palestine was, first of all, that the dispossessors were Jews, where in most cases the dispossessors were Christians in the rest of the world. Secondly, the historical timing. Most of the dispossessions we know in the world happened in the 17th century, early 18th century. This was dispossession that took place during the 20th century, and in particular reached its peak at the time that the world in 1948 ostensibly was committed to decolonization, human rights, and total objection to ethnic cleansing and genocide 3 years after the Holocaust, as is manifested in the Declaration of Human Rights that was established during the days of the Nakba, at the same time, the very same time. Settler colonial movements are these movements of Europeans who are not welcomed in Europe, They seek a new homeland to rebuild a Europe that didn't want them. And as the late Patrick Wolf said, the logic of the elimination of the native is activated at the encounter between the settlers and the native population. Now, elimination can be genocide, elimination can be ethnic cleansing, but one thing is clear: from the very moment the settler community sets foot, usually with the help of an empire, at someone else's land, it wants more territory with as few of the native people as possible. And the Zionist movement was already able, with the help of the British Mandate in the 1920s, to implement the logic of the elimination of the native on a very small scale, one should say. They used a new land laws that the British introduced in the 1920s to evict by force 8,000 Palestinians in 1926, 8,000 Palestinians were evicted from Wadi Hawaris and Marj ibn Ammar on land on which they lived for centuries, under the pretext that because the Zionist movement bought the land from absentee landlords in Beirut, it had the right to dispossess these villages. I don't know if you know that, but about 13 villages were already were ethnically cleansed in the mid-1920s. Under the British law and with the help of the British police, one should say. They came and evicted the people. The Zionists didn't yet have the power to evict anyone by force in the 1920s. The elimination of the native, of course, became the major Zionist strategy and ideology on the eve of 1948. I would not go into all the important junctures of history, which I know you're all familiar with, namely the British decision to leave Palestine in February 1947, the suggestion of the United Nations in November 1947 to partition Palestine to 2 states, the official end of the mandate on the 15th of May 1948, and the end of the operation in Palestine in the very last day of 1948. Within these 5 dates, what is important and relevant to our discussion is the following thing. First of all, the idea that the Zionist movement always uses pretext in order to massively expel people. When the actual ethnic cleansing of 1948 began, which was February 1948, a year after Britain announced its decision to leave Palestine, and the first 3 villages around Caesarea were the first Palestinian villages to be totally emptied by the Zionist forces, while Britain was still responsible for law and order. When the British asked the Zionist commanders, why are you forcefully uprooting these Palestinians from 3 villages around Caesarea, the Zionist commanders explained that this is retaliation for an attack on a Zionist bus a few days ago, which was, again, this was also for their own self-justification. It was not just justification to the world. It was very important for the Zionists to tell themselves that they are not just ethnically cleansing people because who they are ethnically cleansing people because of what they did. But this was just a way of not dealing with the moral implications of uprooting people, and sometimes uprooting them with massacres by a community of people that claim to be representing the survivors of the Holocaust. This was very important. People don't always understand the DNA of the ethnic cleanser that needs themselves justification for themselves, not just for the world. And they need all these pretexts. We can see it in Gaza very much in front of our eyes, but I will leave it to the discussions of other panels. So that's one thing I wanted to stress, this idea that what happened in 1948 was the outcome of an ideology which is not unique to Zionism. It's a settler colonial ideology that sees the native population as the main obstacle for the revival of those refugees who came from Europe and wanted to create a new Europe. Ironically, they wanted to create a democratic Jewish state. And because of that, they could not afford having a sizable number of Palestinians in the new states. The only way of preventing, in a democracy like Israel in 1948, from a majority of Palestinians from participating in the first ever Israeli democratic election was making sure that these people would not be in Israel. And that was very much the high motivation behind the ethnic cleansing operation. The second aspect I would like to point to is the strategy of pushing people within historical Palestine. The aim, as comes out very clearly from the Israeli documentation, the aim was to throw the Palestinians, as many as possible, outside the boundaries of historical Palestine, namely to Lebanon, Syria, Egypt, and Jordan. But there was some complication in this plan. The first one was what became known and was not called that way at the time, the West Bank. The problem with the West Bank was that Israel promised that part to Jordan as part of a secret agreement that Israel had with the Jordanians, that in return for very limited Jordanian participation in the 48 Arab attempts to salvage the Palestinians, Israel would allow them to take what became the West Bank without even shooting one shot. So it became much easier to push people into the West Bank than to try and push them over the river to the other side. So the West Bank became one of the receptors, as far as the Israelis were concerned, for pushing people into those areas. And that explains the high number of refugee camps within the West Bank. And this is something that we are seeing now in the strategic thinking of so-called the Israeli thinking, what to do with Gaza after so-called after the war. And one, I don't remember who, someone already alluded to it in the introductory remarks about someone who said it was nothing new. I think it was Edmund said there's nothing new in the Israeli plans of moving the people of Gaza to Egypt or elsewhere. So that's also important to understand. This also explains to us how the Gaza Strip was created. Because as we know, not only the West Bank is a new geopolitical fictional creation, or not fictional, but artificial creation, I'm sorry, after 48 war. There was no Gaza Strip before 1948. There was Gaza, the city, little towns, villages, but there was no strip. And if you look at the borders of the strip, you can see that they were drawn with a ruler. They're very kind of direct lines, you know. This was an Israeli idea that because they were not sure that the Egyptians would allow them to push about 300,000 Palestinians from Jaffa south to the end of the southern tip of Palestine, because they were not sure they would be able to push them into the Sinai. The Israelis took a decision that they can give up a small part of Palestine and create this rectangle, which is the Gaza Strip, and be a receptor for the 300 and so thousand Palestinians they were pushing. So that was a clear Israeli plan to create the Gaza Strip as a huge refugee camp. I guess I'm not the only one, but there's a famous Israeli document which I would be very happy to share with everyone who reads Hebrew, or provide also the translation for that. What was so difficult for the Israelis is what happened on the 25th of November, 1948. By the 25th of November, 1948, finally they found out that there is a resistance among the villages, especially in the villages around what became the Gaza Strip, which is actually the settlements that the Hamas attacked on the 7th of October. On the ruins of that villages, these settlements were built after 48, right? So there is an order, famous order, it's order number 40. Number 40, 25th of November, from the operation officer of the command, the Southern Command, to the troops. He writes that he's aware that there is far more resistance now among Palestinians to be pushed into the Gaza Strip, especially in 11 villages. I won't give you all the names, but he names all the villages. So he says, this is my direct order to you. This is the 25th of November, 1948. Destroy the villages. Expel all the people from the villages. Burn the houses. Burn the villages, not the houses. Burn the villages and demolish the stone houses. Demolish the stone houses. Burn the villages. This is black and white. I'm not paraphrasing the document. I'm quoting from the document, right? Burn the villages, demolish the stone houses, and put all the people on lorries and send them by force to the Gaza Strip. I think that's very relevant to what's happening today in Gaza. I will end by what for me is one of the most important lessons from 1948, which, of course, there are many more than I have time to elaborate. But I think that there are two lessons, actually, with which I would like to end my contribution. One, and I think it's very important for anyone who especially is engaged in discussions, even with people who are basically in solidarity with the Palestinian people, and who support the two-state solution, and would say, of course, after 1967, what Israel is doing in the occupied territories is terrible. Usually these people know very little of 1948 and don't think that 48 is at all important. That's why the two-state solution is so dangerous. It's another, it's like the JNF forest. For me, the two-state solution is a JNF, a Jewish National Fund forest. It covers 48. If you talk about two states, it means that you erase 1948 from the equation. It doesn't matter. 48 doesn't matter if you go to the two-state solution. Any case, it's very important to remind these people that until the 15th of May 1948, not one Arab soldier entered Palestine. And the British were responsible for the law and order in Palestine. By the 15th of May 1948, before the Arab world decided, so to speak, to go to war into Palestine, already half of those Palestinians who became refugees were already refugees. Most of the urban space of Palestine was already de-Arabized and depopulated by April, by the end of April and the beginning of May 1948. This is so important because I can hear liberal kind of Zionists or even kind of soft supporters of the Palestinian cause saying, yeah, but we know what happened in 48, the Arab world, Israel and the Arab world had a war, and as a result of the war, you had refugees. It happens in wars, right? This is a false analysis. Israel used the war in order to complete the ethnic cleansing, and the Arab world sent troops because its public opinion was already aware about the huge number of people who were dispossessed, including through massacres such as Deir Yassin on the 9th of April, 1948. That's one thing which I think is very relevant to what's going on today. And finally, and for me the most important one, we have to understand how the world reacted to the ethnic cleansing of Palestine, which, as you all know, included a large number of massacres, vicious and brutal massacres as well. The world was aware, and when I say the world, I'm talking about governments, foreign ministries, mainstream journalists. Of course, there was no media, there was no television or internet, but whoever provided information to consumers were fully aware of what happened in Palestine in 1948. There were journalists in Palestine, there were emissaries of the Red Cross, of the United Nations, and so on. They knowingly decided, first of all, not to report what happened, because they had this idea that after the Holocaust, you don't want to blame the Jews of committing war crimes or crimes against humanity. And secondly, there was a sense in the West that allowing a Jewish state to be established is the best way of dealing with the Holocaust and its implication for Europe as a whole. This was the message was very important for the Israelis. Israel continued to use ethnic cleansing after 1948 because the world gave it the impression that in the case of Israel, ethnic cleansing is a legitimate way to establish what they call their national security. So between 48 and 67, Israel continued to ethnically cleanse quite a few number of people who became Palestinian citizens in Israel. During the June 67 war, Israel expelled 300,000 Palestinians. From 67 until recently, by incremental ethnic cleansing, Israel expelled more than 600,000 Palestinians from the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. It needs the pretext of a big war, of course, to go back to the numbers of 1948, and this is what it's doing today. And I'm not sure how many of the people who helped to formulate, and with this I will end, how many of the people who helped to formulate the American, British, or French policy towards Israel understand how their rhetoric and messages since the 7th of October understood in Israel. So I will try and tell you this with the hope that one day we can convince them. The message in Israel is understood very clearly. Because of how you talk about what happened on the 7th of October to us, the Israelis, you actually absolve us from all the crimes we committed until the 7th of October, and you're giving us now a free license to forget about international law, moral inhibitions in what we do in the Gaza Strip. I can tell you with certainty, this is how Israel understands Joe Biden's speech, the British Prime Minister's support, and the Western support. The fact that now, only now, in the last 2 days, you can hear Blinken and Biden kind of trying to limit a little bit the support by saying, the Secretary of State said something horrible. He said, I think that there are too many Palestinians being killed. I never understood this sentence. What do you mean by too many? Is many are okay and too many are not okay? This is the worst moral sentence ever uttered by a Western politician, an American politician, since I think the genocide of the Native Americans. It is such, if you think about this sentence, this is a horrific sentence. Said too many Palestinians have died. Now, all this is not taken seriously in Israel. I can assure you, it's not taken seriously in Israel. The Israelis think that this is just a lip service, and basically 48 is back again, namely a huge ethnic cleansing that all in all, the people who matter in the world, which are the leaders of the West, the mainstream media in the West, it understands us and allows us to perpetrate on the ground. I hope we will find a way of changing it, of course, but I think it's very important to understand these historical context, and without this context, we will not be able to challenge the fabrications and the propaganda that provides immunity for the criminal policies that are unfolding in front of our eyes in the Gaza Strip. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Pappe. This was a fascinating, thoughtful, and a courageous stand that you have taken. I have a couple of questions later on, but right now I would like to invite Dr. Irfan to give us her presentation, and she will be emphasizing Gaza. Dr. Irfan.
Sorry, thank you very much, and thank you to Professor Pappe for his very illuminating presentation just now. I will seek to build further on what Ilan covered by picking up the historical background really from the aftermath of 1948 up to present day, and focusing, as Dr. Ghareeb said, specifically on Gaza. What I would like to highlight in what I'm going to say over the next 10 or 15 minutes are the ways in which settler colonial projects tend to rely on the juxtaposition of forced migration and forced immobility. What I mean by that is that settler colonial powers achieve domination by variously forcing indigenous populations to move, displacing them, expelling them, and then at other times denying them the right to move through encampment, containment, large-scale imprisonment, concentration. We see this across time and space throughout different examples of settler colonial projects. We see it in the history of the US, if we look at the experiences of indigenous Americans who were repeatedly forced off their lands, moved westwards in many cases, as well as being killed en masse, and then eventually forced into contained areas, today reservations. We see similar dynamics if we look at Australia. We see it very clearly through the example of South Africa, whereby the native indigenous Black population were forced further and further into cantons in South Africa, or into areas sometimes known as Bantustans. And we see it in Palestine as well. It's this juxtaposition between forcing people to move and denying them their right to move, and the state will deploy one or the other of these tactics at different times, depending on which one is deemed most instrumental to its goals at that particular time in history. So as Professor Pappe just laid out very effectively, in 1948 or over the longer period of the late 1940s, We saw the forced displacement of very large numbers of Palestinians. We saw them expelled, ethnically cleansed across Palestine and dispersed across the region. But what we saw subsequently then was the enforcement of immobility over them, the denial of their right to move, and specifically the denial of their right to move back, the denial of their right to return, which was, of course, formally recognized by the United Nations shortly after the Nakba, but was never implemented because of resistance from the new government of Israel, resistance which has been maintained by every single government since then. And as a result of that, the displaced populations remained in exile in their place without the right to return back to where they had come from. In some cases, the enforced immobility of Palestinian refugees took on an additional layer to it. So most notably, those Palestinian refugees who had ended up in camps in Lebanon saw particularly harsh restrictions imposed on them in the period after the Nakba, whereby they would often need permission from the Lebanese government even just to leave their camps and go elsewhere within the country, go to visit another camp. So, this immobility, this enforced immobility, was often supported by Arab regimes such as the Lebanese state in these years, which may have purported to be pro-Palestinian, but denied Palestinian refugees living there many basic rights. But what I want to really do is not just dwell on 1948, as important as that is, but look at the longer history and in some ways actually try and bring us up to the present day. And hopefully in doing so, I can follow on effectively from what Professor Pappe covered. After 1948, we have, of course, 1967. And if I focus on the Gaza Strip, I think we can argue that probably nowhere sees itself more directly a product of the Nakba in 48 than the Gaza Strip. Of course, as Ilan talked about, the borders of the modern Strip, the creation of the so-called Strip as an entity is very much directly a product of the Nakba. There was no such thing as the Gaza Strip prior to 1948. There was Gaza, but the Strip itself is a man-made entity as a result of that violence. And of course, the huge transformation in the population, in the demographics of Gaza, are also a direct result of 1948. Prior to 1948, I believe there were about 80,000 people living in the area that became the Gaza Strip. It absorbed more than 200,000 Nakba refugees, so its population more than trebled as a result of the Nakba. It became a majority refugee population. And if we want to talk about how densely populated it is today, we can draw that directly back to the impact of the Nakba. Today, I believe more than 70% of people living in Gaza are Nakba refugees and their descendants. But I said I'm going to jump forward to 1967 because this juxtaposition of forced migration and forced mobility does not end for people in Gaza in 1948 or with what we might call the first Nakba. So in 1967, obviously, the Israeli military begins its occupation of Gaza as well as the West Bank, becomes the longest running military occupation in modern history. And at the very onset of the establishment of this occupation, we see another wave of expulsions. Around 75,000 people are expelled from Gaza, some of whom, of course, in fact, many of whom had already been made refugees in 1948. They were made second-time refugees. They were forced to flee to Egypt. Some went to Jordan, some went further afield. But this was not the end of the latest round of moves of displacement and forced immobility, because once Israel had taken over control of what became known as the occupied Palestinian territories, it faced this quandary of what to do with them, what's sometimes referred to as saying it wanted the land, it wanted the dowry but not the bride, it wanted the land but not the people. In the case of Gaza, Israel regarded it as being particularly undesirable in terms of its population. It was seen as being, the population was seen as being more radical than their counterparts in the West Bank. And if we look in internal Israeli documents, this was attributed in a large part to it having this significant refugee population, and as well as to it having a dense population. And obviously those two things are interconnected. So to confront this, in the early period of the occupation, the Israeli state once again began measures related to dispersal and displacement. It started looking at trying to thin out that population, the idea being that a thinned out population, a less dense population with a lower presence of refugees might be more manageable. And it started by simply trying to essentially break up the refugee camps, by in some cases destroying parts of the refugee camps, demolishing buildings in them, paving much wider roads to make it easier to patrol, dispersing people from them, and then again, when necessary, bringing in forced immobility by imposing closures on the camps that made it difficult for people to organize or become involved in activism. As we move into the 1970s, it goes further, and there are increasing efforts to actually try and move the population out of Gaza altogether. Israel forcibly deports some Palestinians from Gaza into the Sinai, which at that point, of course, was also under Israeli control. And it starts also trying to forcibly expel Palestinians from Gaza into the West Bank and to some degree into Jordan. The efforts to move them into Jordan doesn't last very long because the Jordanian government pushes back against it, but the efforts to move people into the West Bank do continue for a while. And then we know now from archival research, the government started thinking bigger, and they started looking at trying to expel Gazan Palestinians from the region altogether and to get them into parts of North and South America. Offices were set up by the military leaders in parts of the camps in Gaza, offering financial incentives to Palestinians there to start a new life, it was said, abroad in exchange for signing documents agreeing that they would never return. This had very, very limited success. Very few people signed up for it. And so the Israeli authorities turned to different forms of coercion, trying to suppress standards of living in the Gaza Strip in a way that was designed to force people out. The deportations did mean that the population of Gaza fell quite significantly in the years after 1967. But this plan of longer-term gradual movement of Palestinians out of the Gaza Strip was largely unsuccessful because the vast majority of Palestinians were unwilling to go along with it for obvious reasons. So again, Israel tended to return to the usual back and forth between forced migration and forced immobility, but more often within the Gaza Strip. Palestinians in the period between 67 and the First Intifada in 87 were often able to travel between the Gaza Strip and the West Bank, and many of them went into Israel and worked there. But the right of return, of course, remained denied to them, and their right to move remained at the behest of the Israeli state. What's more, throughout this period, as we know, Israeli settlements were being built and expanded across not only the West Bank, but also Gaza, and this always involved the displacement of Palestinians and the denial of their rights in order to make room for settlers. After we had the withdrawal of around 9,000 settlers in 2005, we saw probably quite a definitive swing towards forced immobility for the Palestinians of the Gaza Strip, with, of course, the imposition of the blockade in 2007. Prior to that, longer-running intensification of all kinds of measures undermining freedom of movement there. And this, I'm going to wrap up in a minute because I'm conscious of time, but this broadly brings us up to the present day, where, of course, we have most starkly the combination of forced migration and forced immobility, with Palestinians being told to move out of the northern part of the Gaza Strip, but being denied the right to move any further afield, certainly still being denied the right of return, and being further and further and further squashed and compressed into these corners, which takes me back to how I started. If we think about the dispersal and the compression and concentration of people into enclaves, cantons, bantustans, reservations, we are seeing an acute case of that at play now. And we are arguably seeing the intensification of settler colonial logic that was laid out by Ilan, playing out very specifically in the Gaza Strip today. I'm going to close there, but I will look forward to discussing this a bit more. I'm not sure look forward is the right time, but a welcome question.
Thank you very much for this informative, thoughtful presentation. I think it brought some new information that many people do not know. Dr. Jabarin, please go ahead.
Thank you, Dr. Ghareeb. Just one small note, I'm not a doctor. I haven't got my PhD. Thank you so much. Thank you to the Jerusalem Fund and Palestine Center for the invitation to be here with you today. And it's an honor to be with my fellow panelists. As the General Director of Al-Haq, the Sentinel of Palestinian human rights, I stand before you not just as a voice from Palestine, but as a testament to the enduring spirit of people's quest for justice through the rule of law. Founded in the same era that saw the crystallization of the international human rights regime, Al-Haq was established with the fervent belief that the law would be our shield, our path to self-determination, and our means to end the suffering imposed by occupation. For over 4 decades, we have remained steadfast in our mission, documenting human rights violations and advocating for international legal standards in the occupied Palestinian territories. We embark on this journey with hope, inspired by the promise of global order that would honor the rights of all peoples, including the right to self-determination. Yet, the landscape scarred by conflict and the lives shattered in Gaza and the West Bank speak of a different reality, a reality where international law is selectively applied and where the voices of the oppressed struggle to be heard amidst the clamor of political interests. For over 75 years, the Palestinian people have endured the hardship of displacement and ceaseless turmoil of land torn by conflict. The recent escalation and violence has brought a new attention to crisis that is by no means a new chapter, but a continuing saga of suffering and resilience. The bombardment in Gaza have claimed thousands of lives, decimating families and uprooting over 1 million people from the scrap of refugee they once called home. The devastation in Gaza, the displacement of families in the West Bank, and the daily indignities faced by Palestinians lay bare the stark iniquities of our time. They reveal a world order that far too often aligns itself with power over principle, with the strategic interest over the universal tenets of justice and humanity. This alignment has not only perpetuated the occupation, but has also deepened the wounds of people in search of their place in the world. The fundamental tenets of international law and the human rights were established to protect the weak from the strong, to give voice to the voiceless, and to offer recourse to the powerless. Yet, as we witness the continued expansion of illegal settlements, the detention of children, and the silencing of peaceful dissent, we are forced to confront a disquieting question: has international law become a mere instruments of imperial ambitions wielded to legitimize the status quo rather than to challenge it? This is not merely a theoretical concern, but a practical reality that affects the lives of millions. When political interests dictate the application of law, when powerful states maneuver within international bodies to shield allies from accountability, we do not merely witness a failure of justice. We witness the erosion of a very foundation upon which the international legal order is built. As Palestinians, our faith in the system has been tested time and again. Yet, we remain committed to the principles of justice, equality, and human dignity. Al-Haq's work continues unabated, documenting the truth, challenging impunity, and calling for accountability. Our belief in the power of law to transform societies and to bring about peace remains undeterred. For we have seen that even in the darkest of times, the law can be a beacon of hope, a catalyst for change. What we witness today is the normalization of occupation and the justification of genocide. Our collective silence, especially in the wake of escalating violence, reveals not only a gap in our international framework, but also a crack in our moral foundation. Yet, it is in this silence where we find our resolve, for we recognize that the struggle against an apartheid system is inherently against struggle against international complicity and imperialism. The lack of decisive action by the global community has emboldened the oppressors, and in turn has worn away at the institutions meant to shelter the oppressed. The United Nations call for accountability go unheard, while the serious charge of anti-Semitism is misappropriated to muzzle those who articulate the history of context of Palestinian suffering. This strategic erasure of historical context seeks to obscure the violence born out of prolonged dehumanization. Paulo Freire once said, "Never in history has violence been initiated by the oppressed. Violence is initiated by those who oppress, who exploit, who fail to recognize others as persons." His words remind us that resistance in its myriad forms is a right that is protected by international law, but at the same time is also bound by it. Yet, we must acknowledge a painful truth. The narrative of the resistance in often distorted context is removed, and the voice of the oppressed is drowned out by those who hold the reins of power. This challenge is typified by the ordeal of organizations like Al-Haq, which has been unwavering in its reliance on international law to champion the right of Palestinians to self-determination. The unjust branding of such organizations as terrorist group is an affront to the very tenets of international law, not just to the organizations themselves. When the actions of any nation are treated as exceptions to the rule, it erodes not just confidence in international law, but it threatens the very integrity of the legal system itself, a threat to all humanity. Silence and inaction in the face of such double standard is not neutrality, it's complicity. But ladies and gentlemen, there is another side to this story, a testament to the enduring faith we have in humanity across the world. There is rising tide of voices, awakening of global conscience. People are taking to the streets and cities from coast to coast, not just in protest, but in powerful displays of solidarity that transcend borders and barriers. This global awakening is a beacon of hope. It's an affirmation that despite the darkness of oppression, the light of a human spirit burns brightly. The solidarity we see is not passive, it's a call to action, a mobilization of conscience, a demand for justice, the justice facing the Palestinian people, while unique in its context, is emblematic of the larger tapestry of global injustice. Our struggles are interconnected. The roots of our oppression are woven together, and so too are the paths to our liberation. As we look to the future, we must not only advocate for a just international law, but must also champion the power of the people. This movement, this solidarity in action, in where true change began. The marches in the street, the call for justice echoing across continents, and the ever-growing global community of support are the manifestation of a humanity that refuses to stand idly by. Let us carry this momentum forward, transforming our presence here into action beyond these walls. Let us harness this reawakening of a human consciousness to realize that the battle against apartheid in Palestine is a chapter in the greater narrative of our pursuit of equity and dignity for all. In closing, let us resolve the channel the energy of the global movement into lasting change. Let us affirm that our fight against local injustice is inseparable from our fight against global complacency. We call for an end to indifference, a dedication to impactful actions, and a renewal of our unwavering commitment to human dignity. Thank you for standing in solidarity with Palestine, and may our collective efforts blossom into a future where never again resonates as a reality for all humanity, where justice prevails not just in our words, but in the very fabric of our societies. Therefore, I urge the international community to stand with us, not out of charity, but out of a shared belief in the principles that underpin our common humanity. Let us reaffirm our commitment in a world where the rule of law is not a privilege, but a right afforded to all, where international law serves not as a tool of oppression, but as a foundation of peace and justice. In conclusion, the path ahead is fraught with challenges, but its path we must walk together. We must not allow the political machination of the few to override the collective aspirations of the many. Let us renew our dedication to the universality of human rights and to the pursuit of justice. Let us work towards a future where Palestinians' rights are not a footnote in international discourse, but a central pillar of a just and equitable world order. Let this be the moment where we choose to side with the oppressed, to give substance to the promise of international law, and to forge a legacy that honors the dignity and rights of the Palestinian people. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Jabarin. It's thank you for all your efforts, by the way. Also, what Al-Haq has been doing has been very impressive. And for your information. And this was a very informative presentation. Let me say that I would like to ask the audience, those who, if you have questions or you're interested in sending questions, please don't hesitate. Use the Q&A, question and answer feature at the bottom of the screen if you have any question. One of the things that I would like to ask, actually, I'll ask all of you, one of the things that I've noticed is the language that's being used by Israeli officials, by some of their supporters in the West, and sometimes by US government officials. For example, we have heard that from Senator Graham, he wanted to level Gaza. Actually, Haley, Ambassador Haley, who's a candidate for the presidency, also used similar language. A member of Congress said that we have to make Gaza a parking lot, transform it into a parking lot. At the same time, we have also heard the commander Gallant saying that Gaza will become a city of tents. At the same time, we have heard also from a couple of senior officials who said that the Nakba of 1948 will be nothing compared to the Nakba of the current Nakba, the Nakba in Gaza. We have also heard that we have the term referring to the Palestinians as and people of Gaza as human animals, and the fact that there are no innocent citizens, including babies and children and doctors and many aid workers, all of these people, that there are no innocent people in Gaza. At the same time, we have also seen the use of force, probably unprecedented in a long time. Even it has been recently compared by some people, compared to what the Russians even have used in the Ukraine, does not even compare. In less than a couple of 2 to 3 weeks, there have been something like 25,000 tons of bombs used on Gaza, while Hiroshima was something like 15,000 bombs. To what do you attribute this? Do you think this is part of it has to do with revenge? Has it something to do with a plan to really justify the ethnic cleansing of Gaza and forcing the people out? Is it because this government that exists in Israel, and also a very right-wing government, encourages this kind of language? We remember what Minister Smotrich said about Hawara, basically that he was going to wipe it off. So I would like to hear your explanation of what has been going on. And do you think this is something unusual? Anyone could start. Professor Pappe.
Yes,
and then,
okay, I will try.
Ilan.
Yeah, I think there are two dimensions here to this kind of language and what it actually covers. One is very typical to settler colonial movements. If you are involved in genociding or eliminating people because of who they are, you have to dehumanize them. Dehumanization is a very important part of any settler colonial project, and Zionism is not an exception. And there's nothing new in this kind of language. It appears again and again from the very beginning of the Zionist movement. I can mention the very early mentioning of a reference to this in Theodor Herzl's diary, when he says that the local people would have to be spirited away from Palestine as part of his idea of how to create a Jewish state in historical Palestine. And this is going back to 1897. So, and that's very typical to settler colonialism. There's the other dimension is the what some critical scholars rightly called the Nazification of the Palestinians. This is something that began after the Second World War, when Israel was trying, first of all, the Zionist movement, later Israel, was trying to justify its massacres and atrocities by claiming that actually the Palestinians are the continuation of the Nazis. It began with the way that they framed the Haj Amin al-Husseini, and if you remember, Benjamin Netanyahu repeated this idea, and I think it was 2019, when he told the then British Prime Minister Theresa May that it was Haj Amin al-Husseini who conceived the idea of the genocide of the Jews in Europe. Again, of course, total fabrication of history, but it just shows you something. And some of you would remember that Menachem Begin compared Yasser Arafat in the bunker in Beirut to Hitler in the bunker. Actually, yesterday Netanyahu made a similar reference to this. The Nazification of the Palestinians is a search for justification for what you do to them. It's not only a way of ignoring the historical context of the resistance and its legitimate right to resist. It's mainly a license to explain what you are doing to the Palestinians if hopefully the world would accept that this is what you are dealing with. And if it doesn't work with the Nazis, you compare it to the Islamic State and so on. The third and last dimension is the one Edmund, you referred to. Usually liberal Zionists or kind of mainstream Zionists who may harbor similar ideas of the elimination of the native are very careful in their language. They still want to be considered part of the civilized world. They want to be regarded as people who speak in an acceptable language, and they don't use this vocabulary. But now you have in the government the messianic settlers who have always used this language of elimination and looking at the Palestinians as subhumans or infrahumans. And because of what happened on the 7th of October, even those who usually are very careful not to speak in such language think that there's now a free license to use these kinds of reference, which shows you that it was always there. And maybe the last thing I would say about it, one of the big elephants in the room that because of the way Israel weaponized anti-Semitism in the West, one of the big elephants in the room is referring to something which one should call Jewish racism. You're allowed to talk about Islamic racism, you're allowed to talk about Christian racism, you're allowed to talk about Hindu racism. If you are using racism in conjunction with a Jewish ideology, then you're immediately branded as an anti-Semite. How can you think that the victims of anti-Semitism and Holocaust can be racist? Now, anybody who's a Palestinian knows exactly how Jewish racism looks like on a daily basis, if not an hourly basis. And racism, what is the basis of racism? The basis of racism is the framing of human beings as inhumans, as subhumans. And I think this is very deeply rooted in the Israeli mentality and the discourse. Usually Israelis talk about it with themselves. They try not to talk about it to the outside world. I'm coming back to the point I made in my intervention. They really think that the 7th of October was so horrific that the world is now giving them a license not only to do everything, but to talk in any way that they deem useful or giving vent to this kind of conversation. So it's not just revenge, it's the deeper emotional, moral, or I would call it immoral, foundation of the Zionist ideology.
If I would like to build on what Ilan said, and legally speaking, pure legally speaking, the intention of killings, uprootings, disseminating, eliminating a group of people and national people, ethnic people, it's clear. I think the threshold of genocide, it's there. It's there. And I think they crossed the threshold and they are committing a genocide. When you put and see the intention in their statements, I mean the officials, and the actions on the ground, that they are targeting civilians and babies and children and moms and elders, that's the case. This is the case. Because of that, when we say it's a genocide, no, we mean it. It's not just words here or there, legally speaking. I think it's clear. This is the first clear case. That's the case. Because of that, you will see in the next few days some cases before courts. Some cases before courts. More than that. Also, the others, some leaders and the others, they complicit with these crimes because it was clear since the beginning that there is an intention to commit this kind of a crime. And in the same time, the others, they provided thousands of tons of weapons, to them. More than that, they engage with them to plan, the planning, even the case how to carry out this kind of work. They are even, I think, they are participating in this kind of a crime from the top level till down. That's the case. The US president and his staff around, they are participating and they are complicit also in the crime of genocide. Legally speaking, because of that, this is the first time ever. Now the issue of genocide is studying, and now you see many scholars, many organizations, they are speaking like this.
Okay. Dr. Ann, do you have any comments? Otherwise, I have a question for you from the audience. Basically, one of the question that was being asked is in terms of your experience and what got you interested into the topic, and also whether you are like, what influenced your interest? What made you interested in the topic that you worked on, and how do you was it be in contact with anyone from a Palestinian, anyone from the region? Or they are also asking, how do you teach this to your students? Please, I would let us have some brief responses, because we have to end at 10:50. I have to pass the microphone to other speakers and the next panel. So Dr. Ann, please go ahead.
Okay, thank you. I will be brief. One thing I wanted to add further to what my co-panelists have talked about is that I think this type of discourse also goes hand in hand with undermining the idea that there is such thing as a Palestinian civilian. And I think that's also a very significant factor here. Nora Erekat talks about it as she calls it the shrinking civilian, the idea that what constitutes, or how the category of the civilian is defined has shrunk and shrunk and shrunk over time, so that now it's incredibly difficult for almost anyone to be defined as a civilian in any meaningful way, in any way that's going to have consequences attached to it, that's going to have rights attached to it. I think we saw this most recently with the claim that if Palestinians fail to evacuate northern Gaza, they would be treated as Hamas militants, which again is this idea that the window by which you can properly be treated as a civilian is incredibly narrow, and it's constructed in such a way that it's very difficult for anyone to fit within it. So that is the main thing I would add to what Shawan and Ilan were talking about. Regarding this question, I think this is quite a long answer, so I probably don't really have to go into it. Short answer would be I visited Palestine for the first time in 2007, I believe. So that would be the obvious simple thing that sparked my interest. And in terms of how I teach it to my students, I teach it predominantly, as far as possible, using primary sources. So using documents, personal accounts, video footage, as far as possible, to allow the students to engage with the history on its own terms, rather than seeing myself as an intermediary between it and them. I will stop there.
You need to unmute. You need to unmute. You need to unmute.
I have one other question I would like to ask, and it's related, maybe related to the request by our next moderator, Saeed Arakat, about the media. One of the things that I'm very much interested in, and I would like to hear, maybe Saeed has his views, and if we have time, we'll also take a few comments from our panelists, is the performance of the Western media, the mainstream media outlets. They have basically have not given the Palestinian perspective, and they have dehumanized and demonized at times the Palestinian position. So, Saeed, would you like to go ahead and
Sure, yeah. Yes, thank you. I wanted to ask Alan Pappe, of course, a quick question. I'm really honored to be with everyone. I think, you know, in a very brief statement on the Western media, it not only abandoned, you know, the justice and the morality of the Palestinian cause, but it has actually, it was completely mobilized to justify the genocide that has taken place. I mean, you know, you look at CNN and they basically had a reporter almost at every corner just watching what is going on, exaggerating, of course, you know, a big event nonetheless on October 7th, but, you know, like exaggerating it several folds and continuing to really raise the issues. I think we are beginning to see, as Alan actually noted, you know, we're beginning to see in the New York Times and the Washington Post from time to time how horrific what is being done to the Palestinians is. And so it's getting there. I wanted to take the opportunity, if I may, Edmund, to ask Alan a question. You mentioned how October 7th has been treated as a watershed moment, you know, like there was before and after. I mean, it's like Pearl Harbor. That's what they tried to make it look like, Pearl Harbor, or, you know, September 11 and all these moments and so on. And in fact, it is utilized by the U.S. government, the president, and so on. So no doubt it's a big event. I wanted to ask you, how is it likely to impact Israeli society? I mean, if you were to look down the road, you know, 3 months from today, 4 months from today, what are we likely to see as a result of this, you know, the events of October 7 and thereafter? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Very difficult to look into the future, to ask an historian to look into the future. But I understand what you're asking, Saeed. I definitely do. On one level, in the short term, I think we will see very much the same Israel that there was before. As horrific as the events are and as dramatic as they are, to my mind, it's not a game changer. Namely, what I'm trying to say by this is the following. If you remember, until the 6th of October, we talked about a kind of a civil war inside the Israeli society around the legal reform or the legal revolution. This is not going away. This will come back, namely the implosion of the Israeli society from within that is now put aside in the name of unity in face of a war is already coming back. We already can see it in the Israeli media, namely the inability, and this has nothing to do with the Palestinians. It has to do with the false idea that because people belong to the same religion, they form a national group. That's the main problem. This has nothing to do with the Palestinian. And this is now, you know, exploding. It already exploded in the face of Israel. We forgot, because events are so dramatic, that October was meant to be the month where the legal system in Israel was about to be confronted with the political system in a battle that Israel had never experienced in its last 75 years. So this will continue. But also what will continue is that these implosions from within, unfortunately, at least in the short term, have no influence on Israel's consensual policy towards the Palestinians. Namely, there is no serious political force in Israel that would question a policy of oppression, ethnic cleansing, occupation, demolishing of houses, namely the severe policing that Israel is employing against the Palestinians wherever they are, would not only continue. Unfortunately, of course, the government would use the pretext of 7th of October to make it even harsher by saying now there's something else. But this is the short term. Namely, in the short term, I don't see a fundamental change within Israel or in Israel's attitudes towards the Palestinians. What I do believe, and I hope, maybe it's kind of half hope and half belief, that in the longer run, certain things might begin to rattle this racist, basic Zionist position of Israelis. First of all, because the economy has already suffered enormously from the war. Enormously. People don't talk about it, but this is a huge blow to the Israeli economy. Now, of course, Biden immediately promised $14 billion to assist the economy. I can tell you, I'm not an economist, but $14 billion are not enough to cover the economic damage that the war has caused to Israel. So they will have serious economic problems, and they don't have anymore a social welfare, a social democratic economy. It's a very neo-capitalist economy, which would, widen the gaps between the haves and have-nots in Israel. That's another thing. The last thing I would say that maybe, and this is really a big maybe, if at all this will not be contained in Gaza, if this will become a multi-front confrontation, even a small regional war, not a big regional war, I think this can have a huge impact on a large number of Israelis, especially young Israelis, when they are thinking about the future of their children and their grandchildren. Because after all, you have to remember, what was the biggest Zionist promise? The biggest Zionist promise was Jews can only be safe in Israel. Statistically, Israel is the less safest place for Jews in the world. It's the most dangerous place for Jews to be in the world is Israel. And this is becoming more and more clear. Would they understand that there's a different way of doing it? Would they understand that despite of 120 years of oppression of the Palestinians, there is a vision for a different future for them as well, kind of a win-win situation? This is, in the long run, something I'm hoping for, I'm working for, but I cannot assure you that this will happen. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Pappe. Thank you, Anne, and thank you, Shawan, for very rich, very informative, thoughtful presentations. I will, before I pass the microphone to Dr. Mustafa Eid, I would like to just let you know that I received also a couple of other questions. Maybe others will answer them. They are very important. One of them says, last night I visited the American Indian Genocide Museum, and it is clear that genocide is perhaps the most significant export from North America. How important do you think the land back movement in North America is to change things around the world? That is, does the root of modern genocides need to be addressed? Could it happen the other way around, or is it all unrelated? Then there were questions about the two-state solutions, the future of a solution, and when will the West stop the genocide that's taking place? Thank you again very much, and I'll turn the microphone over to Dr. Eid.
Thank you, Edmund, and thanks to the panelists. It's very hard to put an end to such an enlightening and educational contribution by our panelists. I certainly lived the history in the last 75 years or so, but I learned so much from you all. Thank you. Let's convene in 5 minutes, please, and keep your Zoom running. A biological break for 5 minutes, and we'll be right back.